There is a version of them that you have never seen, a version that exists only in the dark, in the quiet hours when the defenses have nowhere left to hide and the carefully constructed emotional distance they maintain during the day collapses under the weight of something they cannot switch off. You have seen the pulled away version, the cold version, the version that looks at you with something unreadable and then retreats into silence as though the connection between you is something they can simply decide not to feel. You have seen the version that goes quiet for days, that responds with half answers, that seems to exist just far enough out of reach that your hand never quite closes around anything solid. But you have not seen what happens when that version is alone. When the performance of not needing you is no longer required because there is no audience. When the silence they gave you comes back to live in them. That version, the one in the dark in the sleepless hours, turning thoughts of you over and over like something they cannot put down, that is the version this is about. And understanding it will change the shape of everything you thought you knew about what they feel. Before anything else needs to be said, something important needs to be established. Because this conversation exists in a complicated space, and walking into it without honesty would be a disservice to everyone who needs to hear it. The fact that an avoidant lies awake thinking about you does not make their behavior acceptable. It does not retroactively justify the silence, the withdrawal, the emotional unavailability, the maddening cycle of warmth and distance that has likely left you feeling more confused than loved. Understanding the interior of an avoidance experience is not the same as excusing the exterior of it. Their private suffering does not cancel your private suffering. Their unspoken longing does not compensate for the connection they denied you while it was happening. Trauma explains behavior. It does not justify it. A person can carry wounds from their past and still be responsible for where those wounds lead them. An avoidant who loves you in the dark and withholds that love in the light is still making a choice, still failing you in ways that are real and costly. Their sleepless nights are not your consolation prize for a relationship that could not meet your needs. They are a window into the truth, and the truth is both more complicated and more painful than the simple story of someone who simply did not care. So, what is actually happening when the avoidant who hurt you, who went quiet on you, who retreated at the exact moment you needed them to stay, is lying awake in the dark? The first thing to understand is that the silence they gave you was never free. It looked free. From the outside, the withdrawal looked almost casual, like something they did easily, without cost, without the grinding weight that the same silence deposited in you. And that appearance, that infuriating surface of composure, is one of the most damaging illusions of the avoidant dynamic. Because it makes you believe that the distance costs them nothing, that the retreat is relief, that your absence from their actively engaged life is something they breathe through easily. It is not. The silence costs them enormously. It just costs them in private. In the hours when the business of the day is finished and there is nothing left to channel the feeling into, when the distraction and the busyness and the self-sufficiency routines that keep the feeling at a manageable distance have run out of runway, when the mind, finally unoccupied, turns to the thing it has been circling all day without permission. The thought arrives the way it always arrives for an avoidant, uninvited, unwelcome, and utterly unstoppable. Not as a gentle musing, not as a pleasant memory, as a weight, as a specific pointed ache that lives somewhere between the chest and the stomach, and does not respond to logic or willpower or any of the tools that have always worked before. The thought of you in the dark does not behave the way manageable feelings behave. It does not dim with time the way they told themselves it would. It does not cooperate with their need to be self-sufficient, to be fine, to be the person who does not fall apart over a connection they themselves dismantled. Avoidants are, at their core, people who learn that emotional need is a liability, that vulnerability is a door through which pain reliably enters, that depending on someone, really depending on someone in the open, unprotected way that love requires, is the most dangerous position a person can occupy. They learned this young. They learned it in the specific formative way that early lessons are learned, not as information but as identity, not as something they were taught but as something they became. And so they built the architecture that allowed them to survive. The self-sufficiency, the emotional containment, the ability to function, even thrive, at a surface level without needing the deep relational nourishment that most people cannot do without. They became expert at this. They became so good at the performance of not needing that they eventually convinced themselves it was not a performance at all, that they genuinely were fine alone, that closeness was optional, that love was something they could take or leave. And then they met you, and something in the architecture cracked. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but quietly over time, in the specific and undeniable way that a real connection cracks the story a defended person has been telling themselves about not needing anyone. Because you were not a theory, you were specific. You were the particular sound of a voice and a specific quality of attention and a way of being present that registered in them at a level below thought, below strategy, below all the carefully maintained walls. You became the exception that the rule could not account for. And that is why the nights are so difficult for them now. When an avoidant is lying awake thinking about you, they are not experiencing the clean narrative grief of someone who made a clear choice and is at peace with its cost. They are experiencing something far more turbulent and far less resolved. They are in a war with themselves that you have no visibility into and that they would never willingly show you, because showing it would require exactly the kind of vulnerability that started all of this. One part of them, the deep part, the real part, the part that registered you before the defenses could intercept, wants you, not in a vague, generalized sense, in a specific, aching, entirely involuntary sense. Wants the particular experience of being in your presence. Wants the way things felt when the walls came down just enough for something real to pass between you. Wants to undo the distance they created, to reach out to say the thing they have been not saying, to stop performing the self-sufficiency that is exhausting them in ways they will not admit to anyone, including themselves. And the other part, the armored part, the survival part, the part that has been running the show since before you existed in their life, is terrified of exactly that, is watching that want with alarm, is cataloging all the reasons why reaching out would be dangerous, why openness leads to pain, why the brief relief of connection always eventually gives way to the devastation of loss or suffocation, or the unbearable exposure of being truly known and finding it is not enough. These two parts are running simultaneously, at full volume, in the dark, at 3 a.m, when you are not there and there is nothing to do with any of it. That is what their silence looks like from the inside. Here is something specific about what an avoidant thinks about in those sleepless hours, and it is something that will probably surprise you. They think about the moments they got it wrong. Not in a general, abstract way, not a vague awareness that they could have been better. In a specific replaying, almost torturous way. They replay the exact moments where they pulled back when they should have stayed, where they went cold when warmth was what was needed, where they said the thing that created distance because distance felt safer than the alternative, where they watched the hurt register on your face and did not move toward it, did not try to repair it, just let it sit there because addressing it would have required an emotional availability they could not locate in themselves in that moment. These moments live in them. This is important to understand. The avoidant who appeared unbothered during the relationship's difficult moments, who seemed to retreat without visible distress while you processed the pain of their withdrawal alone, was not actually unbothered. They were containing, they were compressing. They were putting the discomfort somewhere internal and inaccessible and telling themselves they would deal with it later, or never, or that it would dissolve on its own if they just did not look at it directly. But it does not dissolve. It accumulates. And in the nighttime hours when the compression is no longer possible, it surfaces, and they are left with all of it at once, all the moments they got it wrong, all the damage their patterns caused, all the specific instances where you deserved more and they gave you less. And they cannot fix any of it, because they are alone in the dark, and the wall they built is still standing, and they still do not know how to knock it down without the whole interior structure collapsing. There is a specific grief that belongs to the avoidant, and almost no one ever names it because almost all of the empathy and attention in these dynamics, correctly, given the circumstances, goes to the person on the receiving end of the avoidance behavior. But naming it here is not about redistributing sympathy. It is about completing the picture, about understanding the full shape of what this dynamic does to both people. The avoidance grief is the grief of self-imposed exile. They are not being kept from you by external circumstances. They are not separated from you by fate or distance or forces outside their control. They are separated from you by their own patterns, their own fear, their own deeply grooved responses to intimacy. And some part of them, in the quiet and honest hours, knows this. Knows that the distance is something they created. Knows that the silence was a choice, even if it was a choice made from fear rather than indifference. Knows that the walls are their walls, and that the person standing on the other side of them did not deserve to be left outside. That knowledge, the private, painful knowledge of self-created loss, is a specific kind of suffering. It does not attract sympathy in the way that more visible suffering does. It lives completely in private, which is where avoidants prefer to keep everything real. But it is real, and it is relentless. Because unlike loss that comes from outside, loss from circumstances, from incompatibility, from the genuinely tragic collision of two people who simply could not work, this loss has an author, and they know it. What do they pray for in those dark hours? What does the wanting look like when it is at its most honest and most unguarded? They pray, not always in a literal sense, but in the sense of a directed, desperate internal reaching, for the courage they could not find in the daylight, for the ability to say the things that sat in them unspoken, for the words that would accurately represent what they actually feel, without the feeling getting lost in translation through all the layers of defense and qualification and self-protection that usually intercept it before it reaches the surface. They reach, internally, for a version of themselves that is not afraid, that can stand in the vulnerability of being truly seen and not immediately want to escape from it. They think about what would have happened if they had stayed, if they had not retreated at the moment the connection deepened beyond their comfort. If they had sat with the fear instead of acting on it, if they had chosen you, clearly and actively and without the hedging and the half-presence that characterized so much of how they showed up, they run alternate versions of the story in their minds, versions where they were braver, where the love found its way to the surface, where the warmth they felt internally made it through the armor and actually reached you in the way it needed to. These are not idle fantasies. They are a form of mourning. The avoidant in the dark, running the alternate version of the story, is mourning a version of themselves that does not yet exist, a version that can love without armor, a version that can stay. This is the place in the conversation where something hard needs to be said directly. The avoidant's private suffering, real as it is, significant as it is, does not excuse them from accountability for the patterns that created it. Their sleepless nights are not evidence that they are secretly a good partner who simply struggled to show it. They are evidence of a person who is experiencing the private consequences of public patterns that were damaging and in many cases deeply unfair to you. An avoidant who lies awake in pain over the distance they created, but who does nothing to address the architecture that keeps recreating that distance, who retreats by day and grieves by night and calls this a cycle rather than a choice, is still choosing. Every avoidant has, at some point, the option of doing something differently, of seeking help, of sitting with the discomfort of their own patterns instead of running from it, of building slowly and imperfectly the emotional vocabulary and the nervous system capacity to be present in the way love requires. Many of them do not make that choice. Many of them stay inside the cycle because the cycle, for all its private pain, is still more familiar and less frightening than genuine change. Because change requires the one thing their entire psychology has been built to avoid: sustained, unprotected vulnerability. Not the occasional flash of openness in a charged moment, not the brief crack in the armor that closes again the morning after. Sustained, daily, ordinary vulnerability. The kind that does not feel heroic or charged or dramatically significant. The kind that is just being honest with another person about what you feel, repeatedly, without the retreat. That is the work, and without it, the sleepless nights are simply the cost of the same choices being made again and again, and you are not required to wait for someone to decide to pay a different cost. Let us talk about the specific texture of what they feel when they think about you in those private hours. Because the internal experience of an avoidant in love, particularly an avoidant in the aftermath of withdrawal or distance, has a very particular quality that sets it apart from ordinary longing. It is drenched in contradiction. They miss you, and they are relieved you are not closer. They want to reach out, and they are grateful for the distance that prevents them from having to navigate the vulnerability of reaching out. They replay the best moments between you with a warmth that is almost physically painful, and immediately follow that warmth with the specific fear that proximity to you activated. They love you, and they are angry at themselves for loving you, because loving you means needing you, and needing you means being at the mercy of something outside their control. They want to be better. They genuinely want, in those honest nighttime hours, to be the person that you needed, and they do not know how to want that, and also maintain the self-protection systems that have kept them emotionally surviving since childhood. This contradiction is not comfortable. It is not a gentle ambivalence. It is a wrenching, exhausting, relentless internal splitting that leaves them depleted in ways that have nothing to do with their external life, and everything to do with the unresolved, unprocessed, persistently real feeling they carry for you. And they carry it alone, because that is what avoidants do with everything real. They carry it alone. There is something about the way an avoidant thinks about your specific qualities in those sleepless hours that deserves attention, because it is not generic, it is not a vague missing of company or warmth or connection in the abstract. It is you, specifically. The particular things about you that broke through the defenses. The things that were different enough, real enough, safe enough in those unguarded moments to get past the wall and into the place where the real them lives. Maybe it was the specific way you understood something about them that they had never articulated out loud. The way you saw through the performance of self-sufficiency to something underneath it, without making them feel exposed or pathetic for being seen. Maybe it was the quality of your attention, the way you listened not just to the words, but to the space around them, to what was being communicated beneath the surface. Maybe it was a moment of genuine laughter, or the way your presence created a specific sensation of ease that their permanently vigilant nervous system almost never experiences. Whatever it was, it registered. It became a reference point, something their interior world keeps returning to as evidence of something that was, however briefly, exactly what they needed without being able to say so. They think about these specific things, in the dark, with a longing that is completely out of proportion to what they were able to show you when you were actually present. And that disproportion, that chasm between the feeling inside and the expression that reached you, is the tragedy at the heart of avoidant attachment. Not the absence of feeling, the inability to build a bridge between the feeling and the person who needs to receive it. Here is something that often goes unacknowledged in the conversation around avoidant psychology, and it matters deeply for understanding those private sleepless experiences. Avoidants are not, as a rule, unaware of their own patterns. Many of them, perhaps most of them, have a significant level of intellectual awareness of what they do. They know they withdraw. They know they create distance at the exact moments that closeness is called for. They know that their responses to intimacy are disproportionate to the actual threat, that the person reaching for them is not the source of danger their nervous system insists they are. They know that the wall is theirs, that the retreat is a choice, even a conditioned one, that the silence they give to the people who love them is not a neutral act. They know this. And in the dark, they know it most acutely. What they struggle with, what the intellectual awareness alone cannot fix, is the gap between knowing and doing. Between understanding the pattern and being able to interrupt it in real time, in the moment when the fear arrives, and the instinct to retreat is louder than the knowledge that retreating will cause harm, the knowledge lives in the prefrontal cortex. The fear lives in the oldest, deepest, most reactive part of the brain, and in a moment of emotional activation, the oldest part wins. Every time, until the work is done to change it, until the nervous system itself is rewired through sustained, supported effort. So they lie awake knowing exactly what they did and exactly why they did it and exactly what it cost, and they still do not have the tools in that moment to do anything about it. And that helplessness, that specific self-aware, utterly private helplessness, is one of the most painful experiences available to a person who has always prided themselves on being in control. The question that the avoidant turns over most relentlessly in those honest nighttime hours is one that they almost never ask out loud. It is the question that sits underneath all the others, underneath the replaying of specific moments, underneath the longing and the fear and the self-recrimination. It is the question that their patterns are, in a very real sense, designed to avoid ever having to answer. Am I capable of being loved the way I need to be loved? Not whether you love them, they know or sense or have some evidence of the depth of what you feel. The question is not about you, it is about them. Whether the version of themselves that exists, defended, withdrawal-prone, emotionally intermittent, is someone who can be loved sustainably. Whether asking someone to love them is asking too much. Whether the amount of patience and understanding and tolerance for distance that a relationship with them requires is a burden that eventually becomes unbearable for everyone. This is the core wound speaking. The early lesson planted deep and early that they were too difficult, too much, too complicated. Not quite right for love in the ordinary, straightforward way, and it lives in them as a fear that runs beneath all other fears, that the people who try to love them will eventually arrive at the conclusion that it is not worth it, that they will discover what the avoidant has always privately suspected about themselves. And so the withdrawal becomes, in a twisted way, a preemptive answer to the question. If they leave first, they never have to find out. There is a particular form of longing that the avoidant experiences which is different from the longing of people with more secure attachment styles, and it is worth naming carefully because it illuminates so much about the internal experience of their sleepless nights. For most people, longing has a direction. It points toward the thing it wants, and if the circumstances allow, it moves that way. It becomes action, it becomes a phone call, or a conversation, or a decision to try again, or to show up differently. For an avoidant, longing is trapped. It points toward the thing it wants and then immediately encounters the wall. Not a metaphorical wall, a functional, neurological, deeply grooved set of responses that intercept the impulse before it becomes action. The wanting is real. The movement toward the wanting is genuine. And then the fear arrives and the wanting gets rerouted into something safer, into busyness, into intellectual processing, into the performance of being fine, into another night of lying awake with the feeling going nowhere. This trapped longing, this wanting without the capacity to act on the wanting, is one of the defining internal experiences of an avoidant who genuinely loves someone. And it is completely invisible from the outside. From the outside, what you see is the absence of action, the lack of reaching out, the silence, the distance, the apparent composure. You see the person who does not come toward you, and you draw the only logical conclusion available to you, which is that they do not want to. But inside the absence of action is a longing that has been circling without an exit for longer than you probably know. Now, because it always needs to be said when discussing avoidant psychology and their private experiences, because the reframe from they did not care to, they cared but could not show it, is one that requires balance to be useful rather than harmful. Trapped longing is still longing that never reached you. Sleepless nights full of feeling are still feeling that never translated into the presence and consistency you needed. The depth of what they carry privately does not change the shallowness of what you received. Both things are true simultaneously. Their internal experience was rich and real and costly. Your external experience of the relationship was insufficient and painful, and ultimately inadequate to the love you are capable of and deserving of. These two truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and sitting with both of them, without collapsing into either they never cared or they cared so deeply, I should wait, is the most honest and most useful place to land. Because you are allowed to hold compassion for the trapped longing and still hold firm to the understanding that love that cannot reach you is not love you can build a life on, those two things are not in contradiction. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Understanding does not require waiting indefinitely for someone whose patterns have shown you clearly and repeatedly what they currently are. Something happens to an avoidant in the aftermath of losing someone they genuinely loved, or pushing someone away through the relentless operation of their patterns, that is worth understanding. Because it is different from what they expected. It is different from what their self-sufficiency training told them it would be. They expected the distance to provide relief. That is what distance has always provided. That is the entire logic of the withdrawal. That space would regulate the overwhelming feeling, would bring the emotional temperature down to something manageable, would restore the comfortable self-containment that closeness disrupts. And for a while it does. In the immediate aftermath of the retreat, there is something that resembles relief. The acute anxiety of intimacy, of being known, of being needed and needing, that quiets. But it does not stay quiet, because what replaces it is not peace. What replaces it is absence. And absence, when it is the absence of someone who has become genuinely significant, has a texture that is completely different from the comfortable solitude that avoidants usually inhabit. The solitude they chose becomes a space shaped by who is missing from it. And the shape of that absence is specific and persistent, and does not respond to the same tools that have always managed other feelings. They did not expect to miss you this specifically. They did not expect the absence to have your particular shape. They did not expect that the relief of distance would have such a short half-life before it became something that woke them up at 3 a.m. and refused to be managed or contained or rerouted into something more bearable. Let us talk about what the avoidant does with those nighttime experiences in the daylight. Because the gap between the two is one of the most important and most painful aspects of this dynamic. In the daylight, the defenses reassemble. The morning comes, and with it the routines and the structures and the carefully maintained emotional management systems that have been running since childhood. The vulnerability of the nighttime, the rawness, the longing, the self-aware pain, gets compressed back into the vault. The composed, self-sufficient, manageable version of them re-emerges and goes about the business of the day. And here is where the cruelty of the pattern lives. Not in malice, but in result. Because the person who was lying awake with genuine deep feeling for you in the dark is the same person who will meet your reaching out, if you reach out, with something significantly more guarded, more defended, more likely to minimize or deflect or create the very distance that their nighttime self was mourning. The shift is not performance. It is not strategic. It is the automatic reassembly of defenses in the presence of the stimulus that activated them in the first place. You are the stimulus. Your presence, your emotion, your love, these are the things that destabilize the composure. And so in your presence, the composure reasserts itself most aggressively. The walls go up highest precisely when you are there. The authentic feeling gets most thoroughly buried at exactly the moment when you most need to see it. And you are left once again with the defended version, while the version that actually experiences the depth of what they feel for you exists mainly in your absence. This is not an accident of timing. This is the architecture of avoidant attachment at its most foundational. Connection activates fear. Fear activates withdrawal. Withdrawal activates longing. Longing never makes it to expression. And the cycle continues. There is one more thing to say about those sleepless hours. About what the avoidant who genuinely loves you is actually praying for when the night is honest and the defenses are finally exhaustedly down. They are praying, reaching, wishing, hoping, in the private language of people who do not know how to ask for help, for someone to understand them without requiring them to perform the understanding in a language they do not yet speak fluently, for someone to see through the armor without making the seeing feel like an assault, for the specific miracle of being known, truly, fully, in the parts that are complicated and broken, and not put together, and not being left because of what the knowing revealed. They are hoping in those dark hours for exactly what you offered them, and they could not receive it. Not because they did not want it, but because their entire inner world was built to protect them from exactly that, from the risk of being fully known, fully loved, and then discovering that it was not enough, that they were not enough. That fear, that specific, foundational, early planted fear is what you are really up against. Not their indifference, their terror, not their lack of feeling, their overwhelming abundance of it, with nowhere safe to put it. You deserve someone who could put it somewhere, who could take what they felt in the dark and carry it into the daylight, who could be awake at 3 a.m. with feeling and translate it into something you could actually receive, not just hold it. Not just carry it in silence while you stood on the other side of the wall wondering if you had imagined being loved. That is what you deserved. Present love. Consistent love. Love that did not require you to develop a forensic understanding of avoidant psychology just to confirm that it was real. Love that arrived on ordinary days, in ordinary moments, without drama or charge or the particular electricity of intermittent connection. Safe, consistent, reliable, available love. The avoidant in the dark, praying about you, they are not your consolation for the love that did not reach you. They are not proof that it was worth it to wait. They are simply the truth. A complicated, painful, entirely human truth about two people and what was real between them and what the patterns of one of them made impossible to sustain. You get to know the truth. You get to feel the complicated weight of it. The knowledge that it was real, that it mattered, that the feeling was genuine on both sides. And you also get to put that truth down and walk in the direction of something that does not require you to decode it. Something that arrives without translation. Something that reaches for you in the light, not just in the private language of the dark. That is not asking too much. That is asking for exactly enough. And you have always deserved exactly enough.